Hello, I'm Jaden Kruger, and this is my class on the philosophy of anarchy. Now, these aren't exactly the circumstances that I hope to teach the class in, but even though this class is online, I hope that you get a lot out of it, because I certainly get a lot out of teaching it, even if it's online. Now, first of all, let's just talk about philosophy as a whole, and why we should study philosophy. So this is a broad definition of philosophy, the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, existence, especially when considered in an academic relationship. So it's really just the study of knowledge in a very interdisciplinary sense. So it can touch on politics, it can touch on psychology, science, and that's what I love about it, is it really just gives you different frameworks with which to think about the world. So in terms of why I personally enjoy studying philosophy, there are a few different reasons. Now for me it's kind of interesting because I'm actually a bioengineering major with a computer science minor, so I don't even really study philosophy in school. It's just something that I've realized is a really valuable part of my life, so I try to fit it in as a hobby, and when taking classes for my major and minor, trying to think from a philosophical perspective. This is because it teaches critical thinking. It can give people the courage to ask really big questions that might otherwise be outside of the scope of an individual discipline, and it deals with these really big, important questions. It also allows you to create your own belief system, which is especially important at the time in our lives that you and I are, where we're formulating a lot of our opinions about the world. So one thing that I like to do in my classes is get rid of the idea that philosophy is some sort of high-minded discipline. It really isn't. It's just a great way to think about things in an in-depth way that'll help you see the world in a new way. And hopefully that's one of the things that you get out of today. So before we talk about something, we should probably have a reasonable idea of what it actually is. So I pose to you, what is anarchy? Because a lot of people think of anarchy, think of loud English punk music, of The Purge, of V for Vendetta, of just generally violence. And that's definitely how the media presents it. But nothing could be further from the truth. So here we want to clarify between anarchy and anarchism. Now really this class should have been called Philosophy of Anarchism, because anarchism refers to the political philosophy surrounding anarchy. But philosophy of anarchy just has a better ring to it, so I decided to go with that. So anarchy can refer to either a state of disorder in the absence of authority, so when any sort of power vacuum happens, often after the fall of one government before a new one comes to rise, or, more relevant to class today, the absence of government resulting in freedom of the individual. This is this ideal form of government that a lot of people see as an ideal to work toward, and that is captured by anarchism, this political philosophy that's skeptical of the use of any sort of power and authority, but especially in the political realm. And that brings us to violence. Now, a couple slides ago when I said nothing could be further from the truth in reference to anarchy relating to violence, this is what I mean. If you were to distill the definition of anarchy, it would likely be a rejection of violence in all forms. Violence here is defined as a force that limits someone's options. So this can be physical violence of, if I were to restrain someone, that would be limiting their options. But it could also be economic violence by gouging wages or keeping someone in a state of unemployment where they're unable to make the money necessary to make economic decisions possible. There are many other forms of violence that you can definitely think of that are sort of non-traditional in the sense that they're non-physical, but that definitely do limit someone's options. If you're looking to personally explore what these might be, just sort of think of, quite honestly, what would feel bad if somebody did it to you? Our innate moral compass is very important here. Now this idea of violence links quite nicely to the idea of power. Power is the ability to alter someone's choices. So you can either expand someone's choices, limit someone's choices, or simply change them. Now again, just like there's many types of violence, there's many types of power. The most clear one is physical power, of if I'm to restrain somebody, I am physically altering their choices. In political or structural power, I'm altering the choices of my citizens by enforcing them to pay taxes, enforcing them to follow certain laws surrounding property, and many things such as that. There's also informational power, if I know something that you don't, that's altering your choices in relation to me. I would encourage you to think of examples of how power can alter choice. So if power is the ability to alter somebody's decisions, either to limit, expand, or simply change, then anarchists are skeptical of all forms of power because it's simply too close to violence, or specifically using power to limit someone's options. And for various reasons, they feel that power is simply too close to violence. It is too close to giving a person or an entity the ability to limit one's options. We'll return to anarchism in a few minutes, but before we do that, I want to go over other theories of political power. A lot of anarchism is built off of the principles of previous political thought, so it's really helpful to have those as groundwork before going on to anarchism. The first theory we're going to go over is the general theory of contractarianism. Now, you may or may not have heard about the concept of a social contract from your classes in school, but the basic concept is this. Imagine a state with no rules. Contractarians, though not necessarily anarchists, would say that this would result in a society of all freedom and no security. They say that this would be remedied by forming contracts. For a simple example, let's say that we're in this state with no rules, and you have an orchard. And I don't have an orchard, but I would like some apples. Now, every day, since other people like apples, a lot of the fruit from your orchard is stolen. So you hire me as a bodyguard, and then as a result of me helping you, give me a few apples. This is a contract that we make. You give me apples, I give you security for your orchard. Contractarians believe that there's no morality until we make it, and that this lack of morality would come from breaking contracts. Now, the problem with these social contracts is that they're not always explicit. For example, you were just sort of born into this country and into the rules that you're expected to follow, and sure, you could leave, but it's very hard to exist in this modern world being under no political social contracts. So there's only a degree of choice. And even then, sure, you can vote and you can vote people into power, but once they're in power, you only have so much control. This brings us to Hobbes. He spoke of a state of nature that would be pure anarchy, and he did not say that in a good way, like we'll talk about later. Hobbes saw the state as absolutely barbaric, and famously described it as, quote, nasty, brutish, and short. He felt that the solution to this would be a Leviathan, or an absolute ruler that would ward off the state of nature. Now, he felt for this Leviathan to have any real authority had to be somewhat of a dictator, and he felt that citizens should obey the Leviathan because anything is better than the state of nature, unless the Leviathan straight up tries to kill many of the citizens. A lot of people disagreed with Hobbes, including Locke. Locke felt that the state of nature would actually be relatively peaceful. Locke also came up with the concept of natural rights. You may notice Hobbes didn't have much respect for the individual, and didn't really have any conception of people having rights. But Locke saw certain rights as inalienable, as just being innate to what makes humans human, and what is necessary to show humans respect. He named these life, liberty, and property. And he said that you would only give up your freedom in order to better protect these rights. Now, you might see the influence here on the Declaration of Independence, which famously says life, liberty, and happiness. And yes, this idea was borrowed from Locke. Now this brings us to Rawls. Now, despite being a 20th century philosopher, he's actually massively influenced a lot of political thought. Now, he grew up in a time of massive inequality, and he saw that people have difficulty seeing and caring about other people's perspectives. So he came up with a little thought experiment. It's called the Veil of Ignorance. He says, okay, imagine that you're building a society, and you don't know who you'll be in the society. You could be somebody who's old, who's crippled, you could be a billionaire, you could be anyone. Now, how do you make that society just? And that's the thing. A lot of inequality under that situation would disappear. A lot of the economic problems that we have would disappear. And he uses that concept to show what is just and unjust. Essentially, if under the veil of ignorance, you wouldn't agree to a society based off of certain rules, then those rules are unjust. Now, a famous example of this in pop culture is there's actually a Doctor Who episode where this exact thing happened, where the Doctor actually put a species of aliens under the veil of ignorance and helped them build a society and reach a mutual agreement. It's called The Day of the Doctor. It's actually pretty cool to see philosophy in pop culture. So now that we have some background on the political theory, I want to talk about ethical theory for a little bit. So there are three branches of normative ethics: deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. Now, virtue ethics is pretty niche and good at making decisions on the individual level, but not on the societal level. So we'll be talking about deontology and consequentialism. And this will come in later when we're defining different types of anarchism. So deontology. Deontology was created by this man called Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant saw the world as becoming increasingly secularized, and he was pretty ambivalent to the existence of God himself, but he feared that the end of Christianity and the end of religion in the Western world meant the end of moral society. So he set out to construct morality from pure reason. He created this thing called the categorical imperative. Now that sounds like a bunch of big scary words, but to split it up, categorical refers to something that's always applied, and imperative refers to a necessary obligation. So something that is always happening and it's always a necessary thing. Kant details two main formulations of the categorical imperative. The first is universalizability. Now he says, quote, "Act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become universal law." So it's similar to the golden rule, or treat others the way you'd like to be treated, in that you should only do something if it can be universally applied. So you might think that it's great if there was a rule that said, I can speed whenever I want. But if the rule was anyone can speed whenever they want, then maybe you'd be less excited about that. And that's sort of why this universalizability feature exists. Another way to formulate the categorical imperative is with the formula of humanity. And here Kant says, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means. This gets at the idea of what being a human actually is. It goes pretty deep. It says that objects are not rational and cannot define their own purpose, but humans can. So by using them as simply means to get to something, keeps them from achieving their goals, and it's repurposing them in a way that's unfair to them. But don't we kind of use people a lot? I mean, I go to the store, people check things out, I use my professors for learning. Is Kant okay with that? And Kant would say that there's a difference between using someone for mere means and using someone for a means. So as long as you recognize their humanity and have some sort of consent in there, it's okay. Now we get to the second and final branch of normative ethics that we'll study today, consequentialism. So to compare and contrast deontology and consequentialism, deontology says, in a nutshell, that the means justify the ends, whereas consequentialism says the ends justify the means. So deontology says that there are just actions that a priori are inherently good and others that are inherently bad, and the circumstances ultimately do not change these. Whereas consequentialism says we need to look at the consequences of these actions. So murder can be good. For example, it's a famous trolley problem of, sure, you might throw somebody in front of a train, but if that'll save 3 other people, then that's a net positive and it's good. So to judge the morality of an action, we must look at the consequences. Utilitarianism is a branch of consequentialism that was pioneered by Jeremy Bentham. It states that an action is moral if it maximizes the most good for the largest number of people. Or, alternatively, if you're looking at negative utilitarianism, that it minimizes pain for the most number of people. Now there are a couple of thought experiments here. The one that's shown in the image is the famous trolley problem, that you're an operator for a trolley and you see that the trolley is going to go down the tracks and hit 4 people that are tied. Now you can flip a switch and then the trolley will switch tracks and kill 1 person. Kant says you should not flip that switch. Because the 4 people are going to die anyway. That's not you intervening, that's just what's going to happen. But if you flip the switch, then you are making the decision to kill someone, and that is wrong. Now, of course, utilitarians would disagree. It's basic math. There's 1 person on one track, there's 4 or 5 on another. Of course we flip it. So I think that most of you, and I'm backing this up with statistics of studies different universities have done, would choose to flip the switch and would choose to kill the 1 instead of the 4. But it gets a little bit more complicated. Let's say you're the doctor at a hospital and you have 5 patients. 1 of them needs a heart replacement, 1 of them needs a kidney, 1 of them needs a liver, so on and so forth. And they're all going to die without it. Now imagine that a healthy patient comes in, well, relatively healthy, named Chuck. And you test Chuck and you realize that his blood type, his immune system, everything is compatible with every single one of those 5 people that's about to die in your hospital. So, according to utilitarianism, you should chop up Chuck and use his organs to save the other 5 people. So why is this different? It's the same exact math. And this is the thing with utilitarianism, is it can get us into some really icky feeling moral situations. And so that's an important thing to explore in the wider context of philosophy. Now we're finally going to circle back to anarchy, keeping in mind what we learned about ethical philosophy with both consequentialism and deontology. Broadly speaking, there are 2 justifications for anarchy. The first is an a priori justification pioneered by Robert Paul Wolff. This one is largely deontological and as a result takes a pretty absolutist approach and says that all states everywhere are unjust. The general argument is that legitimacy rests on obedience, which inherently requires limiting one's options, which, limiting one's options, back to the very beginning, that's the definition of violence, and violence for Robert Paul Wolff is bad and immoral. So, therefore, no states can be legitimate. Now, this is a priori because it does not rely on the existence of any actual state, and because it takes that deontological, approach. Now, a posteriori justification is a little bit different. This says that states could be legitimate, but the burden of proof is placed on the authority, and there is proving that needs to be done. Now, this is based on consequentialism, looking at the consequences of the state's actions and evaluating whether or not they're just. Now, a lot of a posteriori justification is based off of historical examples of dictatorships and brutality under various governments. States simply don't produce the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amounts of people, and a posteriori anarchists think that there's a better way to go about it. Now again, a posteriori because it looks at the effects of the state's existence, which makes it more of a consequentialist framework. Now we're going to do a section on a very, very important part of anarchism that's very dear to my heart, and that's important to a lot of different philosophy. So praxis is just the practice of putting things into action. It's putting theory into action. So we don't just want to sit up in our ivory tower and write philosophy, we want to actually do it. We don't just want to talk about the world we want to bring about, but we want to bring it about. Now this is not unique to anarchism. It is definitely more focused on leftist philosophy though, but the word praxis is used in a lot of different situations. So we're going to talk about it mainly in the anarchist sense. So the general idea behind praxis is that yes, theory is still important. It's just not the end goal. So theory will lead to what sort of actions you'll take. This action will lead to a period of reflection where you assess whether or not your action was successful in bringing about a better world, a more just world, a world with less violence, and then you adjust your theory and you start the cycle again. But the important part is that this cycle is not made up of theory alone. Now this is just a visual that shows various forms of praxis, and it shows how to essentially live your life in a more anarchist sense. So the least anarchist praxis would be monetized formal labor in the private sector, whereas the most anarchist praxis would be non-exchange labor. So this is just a helpful guide for how to live your life like an anarchist. Now in terms of protest, this is something that a lot of people are very iffy on. They want to go to protests, they want to bring about change, but a little voice in the back of their head says, is this actually doing anything? Now most anarchists say protesting might do something, but it definitely isn't praxis in the truest form. It might bring about change, but not in the way we want. The idea behind praxis is that there is no separation of the revolutionary process from the revolutionary goal. So protests, petitioning, going through the system is still working within the system. And it's just saying, please, can we bring about a more just society? An example of praxis would be, let's say that your society isn't doing enough to help victims of domestic violence. You would perhaps occupy an abandoned warehouse and create a domestic abuse victim shelter in that warehouse and operate out of it. That is you seeing a problem and working to solve it. Another form of praxis would be saying, I don't like capitalism. I think that is repressive and it is bringing about violence in society. And then going off into the woods and forming your own commune. Now you can see that these are radically different approaches, but both would still fall under praxis, though there is a lot of debate over sort of which types of praxis are worthwhile and which aren't. Now on to types of anarchism. This to me is a really, really fun part of the presentation because I get to show you the multitude of forms that anarchism takes. Now, broadly speaking, all forms of anarchism fall on a spectrum between completely individually focused and completely collectively focused. Now, more individualistic approaches focus on the self, and saying that the state is evil because it hinders self-development and self-will, and that we ought to free the individual from the state so that they can develop as an individual. Now, this is a link to liberalism, and if you think of the way that the Iron Lady quite famously spoke of the greatest minority is the individual, this is a sort of minarchism of reducing it down to the smallest possible unit, the individual, and asking for anarchism from that. Now, there's an offshoot of anarchy that isn't accepted by most anarchists called lifestyle anarchy. And the idea is, let's not worry about creating a whole anarchist society. Let's just not live by the rules as individuals. It's essentially, screw everyone else, I'm all that matters. Now you'll notice a strong link to egoism, or the concept that we should only worry about ourselves, and to a lot of works of Ayn Rand, of essentially justifying caring for the self over everyone else. Now there are more kind, legitimate, individualistic approaches that focus on the way that the state hinders human flourishing on an individual level. More interesting, though, in my opinion, are the collective approaches to anarchism. The general idea here is that social development is more important than individual development, as it'll simply affect more people. And they largely focus on non-coercive social structures. Now that, to me, is just a beautiful concept. The idea of people working together in a way completely free from violence and coercion in a completely consensual way. I think that's, in many ways, the best one could hope for humanity. Now, I'm not going to play this video during my slides, but it's called Anarchist Taco Stand, and it's very entertaining and shockingly informative, so I would recommend, if you're interested in this, to go back and watch it. But anyway, let's go over a couple different types of anarchism. The first one being anarcho-capitalism. A lot of people completely denounce this as a theory because they feel that it's just so antithetical to what anarchism stands for, because of the pure amount of violence that capitalism inflicts on people. The idea behind this is that free market exchange allows for consent. And going back to the idea of contractarianism, anarcho-capitalists are huge on contractarianism. The idea is that the free market will work naturally to maximize happiness through a contractual society. However, it does depend on people following the harm principle. The harm principle can be nicely summed up by the quote, "Your freedom to swing your fist ends where my face begins," by John Stuart Mill. Essentially the idea that you can do whatever you want as long as it's not hurting anyone else. But in anarcho-capitalism, there's no real way to force this, and many people feel that it just leads to more opportunities for coercive power as a result of capitalism. There are also questions of, were you in a truly anarchist society? How and why would money exist, since in our current system, it's so tightly regulated through the government and through the Fed, so there are a lot of questions there. Anarcho-syndicalism is probably the type of anarchism that has the largest effect on our world. Syndicalism is a 20th century labor movement that continues on strong today. The idea is that revolutionary unions are a way to get back power to the working class that was previously taken from them by the higher classes. It's quite light on the theory, which the more you look into leftist philosophy, the more appreciative you are of that, to be honest. And it focuses on the economic arena. Whereas a lot of other labor movements at the time were trying to go the political route and get somebody in office or sign petitions, anarcho-syndicalism was very focused on forming co-ops, forming unions, and getting back the power in the economic arena, ultimately because they felt that it was the economic situation that was causing the oppression and the violence. Now, related to anarcho-syndicalism is anarcho-communism. But before I talk about anarcho-communism, I want to talk about communism as a whole to make sure that we understand that concept. Communism was first theorized by a man named Karl Marx, who had this concept of historical materialism. Now, historical materialism says that economic systems are defined by their mode of production, and during the Industrial Revolution, the means of production were switched away from workers. Karl Marx pointed out that the bourgeoisie will always profit from the surplus value that workers produce, because otherwise they would get no profit from whatever was made. But as a result, workers are always underpaid for their work. So he felt that the only way to remedy this was to allow workers to own their labor. And in order for them to own their labor, they had to own the means of production, so the land, the machines, all of that as well. He felt that pre-industrial revolution, the system worked better because the workers did own the means of production, so even if they had to give a cut to a feudal lord, it was a little bit better. But ultimately, what he wanted was control of these resources by the collective. Now, one part of Marx that people don't talk a lot about that I think is particularly important is his concept of alienation. Now, of course, he goes into this in a lot more detail than I will, but imagine that you are a pre-industrial revolution craftsman and you make teapots. You might spend as much as a whole month making a teapot, and you'll shape the teapot, you'll paint the teapot, you'll put little details on the teapot, you might even make custom teapots for people, and then you'll sell those teapots, and you'll get to see the joy that people get from buying those teapots and using them. That's really fulfilling for you. You get to do a lot of different tasks, you get to do something that you love and you're good at, you can be your own boss, and you have the sense that you're providing value to the world. Now let's fast forward a couple hundred years, and maybe you're in a teapot factory, but maybe you just do one little part, like you paint the button on top of a lid or something. And you do that all day long. And you know that this is just one teapot of many that the teapot company sells, and you're just doing one little part, and you never get to see those customers smile. You may not even know if it's a bad teapot or a good teapot because you don't see the finished product. Bottom line, you're completely alienated from the people out in the world that you're trying to help, from your actual desires and interests, and you don't even own your labor. I noticed this a lot with my friends when we started to go on co-op. I had this one friend that was working in quality assurance at a software company, and really all he was doing was creating very basic tests to say whether or not code worked. He wasn't even fixing it, he wasn't really writing code, and he didn't feel like the ultimate product of the company was at all valuable to the world. He actually got really depressed, and this is just one of the effects that capitalism can have on us. It can have these really negative mental health effects. So for that reason, I think that alienation is a really important thing to discuss, and there's really clear links to anarchism here. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the terminology surrounding communism because there is a lot of confusion about it, and depending on who you're talking to, the terms communism and socialism can mean completely different things. A good case study of this is the Soviet Union. Was the Soviet Union communist? No, it wasn't. There was a Communist Party that ran the Soviet Union, but calling themselves the Communist Party was just a way to signify that what they ultimately wanted was communism. Communism is this idea of a stateless, moneyless, classless society. That's what, at least the good people in Russia, were trying to achieve. They saw socialism as a path to the idea of communism. Now, socialism is a set of policies and a type of government in place as a transition period between a capitalist system and a communist system, of providing more safety nets, of helping workers own their labor as much as possible, and providing fair wages to individuals. Now finally we get to anarcho-communism. So anarcho-communists see wage labor and systemic poverty as a form of violence. So all of the problems with capitalism, they say, yes, this is violence. We have to get rid of it. And then they try and come up with a solution. Now they do differentiate between usage and ownership, and they feel that usage of things is very good, but ownership is bad. Ownership leads to violence. They ultimately promote freedom and leisure time. They don't want you to be a slave to production. Think about all the people in your life that work crazy 70 hours a week and aren't even happy. Why are they doing that? It's because money has this huge hold over us in society, and anarcho-communism wants to relieve that hold. Anarcho-communism wants to get rid of alienation. Anarcho-communism wants people to have jobs that are meaningful to them. Now, a lot of people point out that this is no different than communism. If communism is a classless, stateless, moneyless society, isn't this pretty anarchist? And it is. And some people put the anarchist part in anarcho-communism simply to emphasize the anarchist perspective of communism, but some put it because their methodology of bringing out this new system is different. A lot of communists believe that socialism is the way to communism, that it's necessary to have this transition period, whereas a lot of anarcho-communists feel that we shouldn't have a transition period, that we should either have a large revolution and go directly into communism, or have a bunch of little pockets that form as communes that then eventually federalize into one larger anarchist society. Now for something a little bit different, anarcho-primitivism. This is a return to non-civilized life, though anarcho-primitivists might reject the terms civil and uncivil because of the negative connotations associated with them. They claim that civilization leads to domination and control, and that prior to development, more equality, leisure time, and connection were present. There's actually pretty good evidence of this, of how over the years our leisure time has just decreased and decreased. Especially if you look at the years post-industrial revolution, people had very little leisure time, at least the working class. So the anarcho-primitivists raise an interesting point. We've been talking a lot about violence and which systems lead to violence or are themselves violent, but we've only been talking about violence as it pertains to humans, as it limits human options. Anarcho-primitivists branch out a bit, and they talk about the domination of plants and animals that occurs under the current system. They also say that modern society is actually what necessitates humans committing violence, and that were we to live a more primitive lifestyle, we wouldn't need to commit violence. There's also a link to green anarchism or anarcho-environmentalism, saying that environmental degradation is violence. In some formulations, this is violence directly against the environment. In others, this is violence against the animals and plants or even other humans. There's an interesting point to this. I mean, the societies that are going to be most affected by climate change are not the most developed ones. They're the least developed ones. This seems incredibly unfair and incredibly violent against those societies without even looking at the plants and animals involved. Anarcho-primitivism is also committed to the concept of rewilding. They're very big on praxis, and they have their unique way to do this. A lot of them seek to regain primal skills and lifestyles, and also focus on deindustrialization, of returning to our roots, and of bringing this new system about. Finally, anarcho-feminism. Sometimes it's spelled with an O, but the A is just there as a way to fight against the patriarchy a little. It's kind of fun. This explores anarchism through the lens of feminism, or vice versa. Critiques see the state as a source of gender-based oppression and see dismantling it as a way to create a more just society. Many critiques also point out how authoritarian traits are seen as preferable in both societies and in individuals, and that these authoritarian traits are taught to us as being traditionally male. So, men are authoritarian, and authoritarianism is good, therefore men is good, and that's how the patriarchy perpetuates itself. It also has a focus on sexual freedom and looks at the various ways that violence is committed through controlling women's sexualities, whether it be through not allowing women to express their sexuality, through not allowing for birth control, through forced sterilization, through rape. All of these are ways to limit the options available for women and to ultimately inflict violence upon them. So far, when we've looked at anarchism, we've ultimately critiqued the current system on the state level. But anarcho-feminism takes this a step further and opposes familial structures as a whole. You can look at the various ways that marriage and the way women are treated growing up is in fact inflicting violence on them. This can be combined with other types of anarchism as well, as it really is just a lens to view things through. And in recent years, anarcho-feminism has become more inclusive of transgendered individuals and non-binary individuals and has combined with queer theory to produce new theories of anarchism. Hopefully you enjoyed this presentation, and if you would like some additional resources, I've put them here. Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy is a great in-depth knowledge source of any philosophy topic you could think of. r/philosophy is great for information and discussion. r/askphilosophy, I forgot to put it on here, but it's great for asking questions. Philosophize This is an absolutely fantastic philosophy podcast. Oh, and I actually forgot to put it on, but Hi-Fi Nation, HI-PHI, literally my favorite podcast. It's like if you took Radiolab and made it philosophy. It's really cool. Anyway, School of Life Philosophy playlist, specifically their philosophy playlist, is okay. It's good, short introduction videos. The rest of their videos are kind of bad though. Crash Course Philosophy, Hank Green did a wonderful job. It's incredibly entertaining, but also very informative. Philosophy Tube, all these older videos tend to be more educational. He actually made them for British students trying to pass their A-levels in philosophy, but his newer ones are some really cool leftist critiques, so I definitely check those out. Angie Speaks, she's an anarchist philosopher, doing a lot of leftist content, very good. And then r/communism, r/communism 101, and r/anarchy. Really, Reddit is just a great resource in general, so I'd encourage you to look at that. I really hoped you enjoyed my presentation. Again, I'm sorry that I'm not here in person, but if you have any questions, please email me. I mean, I'll likely be on lockdown a couple days from now, so I could probably use with the mental stimulation, and even if that's not the case, I absolutely love talking about philosophy and I absolutely love teaching philosophy, so please shoot me an email, let me know what questions or comments you have. Thank you so much for listening.